the man.
Jim, yeah.
Jem Jalal. So I'm just getting the definition of it up. A Koddywampler is someone who travels in a purposeful manner towards a vague destination. And it's an old English term that I quite like. For me, it describes agility quite well. You're traveling purposefully towards something, but you don't quite know which direction you're going to take along the way because you're using variable inputs, data that you learn along the way to drive the ultimate direction you take. Now, I'm not saying adding Koddywampler here to principle 2, but the principle, the intent behind it, I quite like. Okay, now you guys can see here the rest of these principles. Are there any here that you feel should change? Pick one and we can talk them through.
From my experience, principle 12 around at regular intervals, the team reflects and how to become more effective. 90% of people I talk to immediately take that to mean we can then only reflect on those regular intervals as opposed to when the need arises. Yeah,
I've seen that many times. And you'll probably see this in situations where there becomes a defined cadence, whether that's your 2-week sprint and you only do retrospectives at the end and you only take action based on what you learn at the end of that. There is becoming less common, but a very common human resources practice is doing yearly appraisals. And a yearly appraisal means that in that few weeks right before that timeline or that deadline to get it all in is due, everyone scrabbles around to collect any evidence, to think about what they did 9, 12, 11 months ago, to try and capture all that data and remember it all. And then the same thing happens with the line manager. They're doing the same. And ultimately, the consequence of that is you sit down as a pair and say, oh, this is what I did in the past 12 months. And now I can only make any change in the next 12 months. It's a huge feedback loop. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I also think number 8 comes from a position of real privilege that doesn't really exist for a lot of people.
I think today in particular, number 8 is the one that I would fundamentally change the most. I personally believe that I can foster an environment where virtual working is just as successful as face-to-face working. And the reality is today that we are moving further and further away from a privileged situation where we can have face-to-face as the norm. Think about how many companies are transitioning to remote-only working. Microsoft have just done it. GitLab, they have I think they're one of the first companies to go fully remote working, and they're releasing training courses on how to do remote working. And I love the concept of having a remote working charter, a concept where you work with your people to understand what does good remote working look like, what does bad remote working look like, what experiments do we want to try to make remote working successful for us, what do we need from one another, and that becoming a baseline as an experiment for what we can try and learn from going forwards. I think the reality is face-to-face conversation these days is going to be moving further and further away, especially as we have today's current pandemic situation.
I think it's really interesting because I'm currently working as COO of a startup management consultancy with an old school friend who I have not seen in person since school. But for the last 6 months, we have been sort of partnering up on launching his startup management consultancy business. And it's been extremely successful, but we've not ever once been in the same room.
But have you met over Zoom or WebEx?
Yeah, no, of course.
So that's the face-to-face. Yeah. Face-to-face is still the best way for conveying information. Whether you're a million miles away and you've got some hyperlink device that displays your vision in near real time, you're still face-to-face. You're just not in the same room. And so it still applies. It's better than text. It's better than telephone. It's still the most efficient, effective way of communication. The fact that you're not in the same room, we now have the technology to overcome that.
Sure.
So I think, I think the crux of this one is correct. It's the most effective for conveying information. But the reality is that we don't always have that luxury. And in fact, a lot of companies are being very successful whilst asynchronously working. They will have face-to-face conversations for just a small portion of their day, for maybe a few key meetings. And then the rest of it is asynchronous working. And they've developed methods, approaches, ways of working that work for them that enable them to transparently share progress and collaborate asynchronously. So again, I don't think the major intent of this one needs to change, but it could probably be altered slightly to reflect the realities of today.
It doesn't mean you need to be co-located like
Yes.
people used to take it.
And I think this is the challenge, is that most people have taken this to mean, oh, we've got to be co-located. And I think in particular, this last 8 months or so has proven otherwise. We don't need to be co-located to be successful.